Hello and welcome to Bradbury 101. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the birth of the American author Ray Bradbury, and during that year I ran a podcast, an audio podcast called Bradbury 100, a celebration of 100 years of Ray Bradbury. What I realised as I was putting that podcast series together is that it was mainly preaching to the converted. It was very much a celebration of Bradbury for those who already know the works of Bradbury. And I interviewed many people on the podcast, most of whom had either worked with Ray, knew him personally, or were very much inspired by Ray. What I want to do this year is Bradbury 101, which is kind of getting back to basics. What I want to do is introduce you to Ray Bradbury, especially anyone who has never read any Ray Bradbury, never seen any adaptations of his work, or who is perhaps just a little bit confused about where to begin with an author who wrote so many works over so many years. So in Bradbury 101 we're going back to basics, and each episode I'll be giving you suggestions of what to read, what to watch, how to get started with Bradbury. Now, one of the first difficulties with Bradbury is that huge amount of work. He was a very prolific author, so where on earth do you begin? If you're a fan of short stories, then you probably can't beat either of these two books. They have similar titles, but they actually have totally different contents. The Stories of Ray Bradbury dates back to the late 1970s or early 1980s, and it's kind of a greatest hits compilation, the best short stories that Ray had written up to that point. But bear in mind, we're talking about an author here who went on to live for maybe another 30 odd years, and in that period he never stopped writing. And that's where the other volume comes in, Bradbury Stories. This is a later in life compendium containing 100 stories, but so did the first book. And you might think, this is a follow-up, this contains the later stories, but no, it doesn't. Miraculously, both books contain 100 stories. Both of them span Bradbury's entire writing career up to the point where they were published. And yet, there is no duplication here. 100 stories in here, and absolutely no overlap with this one. So which one is the best to get? Doesn't really matter. They're both full of cracking stories. Really well worth reading both volumes. But get hold of whichever one you can. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it could be a rather large investment of money, and certainly a large investment of time to read one of these. It's 900 pages of stories here. 100 stories, 900 pages. That's an average of about 9 pages per story. Just shows that Bradbury was a very keen short story writer, and he admitted that. He admitted that he was more of a short story writer than he was a novelist. But maybe that's too much to read, maybe too much money for some people as well. Where else could you start with Bradbury? Well, you could take one of the best short story collections, or you could start with one of the novels. So let's have a look at my suggestions for those. If you're into short stories, my suggestion would be The Illustrated Man. Now, this is an old UK paperback version that I've got here. The Illustrated Man is a collection of mostly science fiction stories. They're not all science fiction, there are some fantasy stories in there, and the curious thing about the book is, although it's a collection of stories, it has this kind of framing story, which is a thing that Bradbury did quite a bit in his early books. He would take a load of short stories that had been published separately in magazines, he would then put them together into a novel and have some kind of linking concept. So this applies to The Martian Chronicles, it applies to Dandelion Wine, and it applies to The Illustrated Man. The extent to which he wove those things together with a linking story varied from work to work. And in the case of The Illustrated Man, it's really just a kind of a packaging device. So when you first start reading The Illustrated Man, you read about this guy covered in tattoos, the title character. And it turns out that each tattoo is a story. And then Bradbury goes into the first short story and then into the next. Every now and again we dip back out to the Illustrated Man himself, and at the end of the book we come back to the Illustrated Man to discover his fate, if you like. But it's really a collection of short stories. You can dip in and out at any point, and many of them, but not all, are science fiction. and these are really classics of Bradbury's science fiction. And they tend not to be space opera. These tend to be stories set in suburbia, some that are about time travel, virtual reality, all the classic ideas of science fiction, some of which Bradbury invented, incidentally, all represented there in The Illustrated Man. So that's my recommendation for the first short story collection that you read if you've never read any Bradbury. That doesn't necessarily mean it's my favourite short story collection. When I'm asked about that, I usually will point to another book which is called The Golden Apples of the Sun. That's partly because of how I discovered Bradbury personally. It was the first Bradbury book that I read. But when I'm recommending collections of short stories, it's usually The Illustrated Man that I'll point to. But if you prefer your fiction longer, if you like a novel, then I would recommend Fahrenheit 451. Again, it's science fiction, but it's more of a social satire than anything else, and it very much speaks to today's world. It's got all sorts of things in there that absolutely relate to today's world. There are characters in here who go through life with earbuds in, kind of blocking out the real world. There are characters in here who take drugs to escape from reality. There are characters who spend all of their time, well, drugged out on television, except television in Fahrenheit 451 isn't just a small screen like you're looking at now. It's a massive wall screen. Television in the future of Fahrenheit 451 is all-encompassing, almost a kind of a virtual reality experience. The book is about book burning, and this, again, 1970s, 1980s British edition that I have here is probably my favourite Fahrenheit 451 cover, because the way it's designed, it's as if the cover itself is on fire. The book is an example of the thing that the book is about. I think that's a really ingenious cover. Some people say, well, it's about book burning and it's set in the future. That sounds unlikely. Aren't books on the way out? Isn't it all Kindles and e-books nowadays? Well, just think about that for a second. The Kindle, what does that refer to? If you Kindle something, aren't you setting fire to it? The very notion of the Kindle, the name of the Kindle, is a reflection of the idea of book burning, which is an idea that many of us find really quite offensive, the idea that ideas could be set aflame to and disposed of. So Fahrenheit 451, yes, it's about book burning. Yes, in a way, it's a little bit odd that people in the future, some unspecified future, might be burning books. Won't they have all of their books stored on computer by then? But that's missing the point. What the book is about the destruction of knowledge, the knowledge that is contained within books, and also the destruction of opinions. And what the characters in the book do, without wishing to spoil it for anyone, is that there are some characters in there who set about memorising books, so that even if the physical books no longer exist, the ideas within can still exist, because they're preserved in the memories and the minds of people. And that's really quite a challenging, radical thought, that it's not the words, it's not the printed pages, it's the thoughts and concepts in a book that we need to treasure and carry forward. Kind of takes us back to the oral tradition of storytelling in many ways. So anyway, if you're looking for a Bradbury novel to get you started, I recommend Fahrenheit 451. Now, does that mean that Fahrenheit 451 is Bradbury's best novel? It's a matter of opinion, of course, and it depends on what you want in a novel. If you're more interested in fantasy stories, you might want to try something else, like Something Wicked This Way Comes. But if you're happy with a bit of science fiction, a bit of satire, then Fahrenheit 451 is probably Bradbury's best written book. And, well, he had it put onto his gravestone. His gravestone simply says, Ray Bradbury, author of Fahrenheit 451. He clearly thought this was the book that he would be remembered for, and I think it's probably correct to say that. So those would be my suggestions if you're getting started with Bradbury: Illustrated Man for short stories, Fahrenheit 451 for novels. And incidentally, Fahrenheit 451 is not an enormously long novel. Again, looking at my ancient British paperback, look how yellowed the pages are in this. 150 odd pages. It's, by today's standards, this is a really very short novel, and in fact it barely counts as a novel. It's probably half the length of anything that would be published as a novel today. Now the next thing that I want to look at is some other ways of getting into Bradbury. We talked about some ways in through his own fiction, but there are some other ways in, and these are sort of coming from different directions really. The first is biography. Now there are quite a few biographies of Bradbury out there. There's a book which is kind of for a general reader, which presents Bradbury's own recollections, so it's not sold as an autobiography, but it's the closest you'll get to an autobiography. There are also biographical volumes which talk through Ray's life in detail and talk about the composition of the individual works, the classic works from his career. And there are a number of books for children and young readers which kind of give a mini biography of Ray alongside talking about his stories. But if you're a general reader and you're trying to find out more about Bradbury, where should you start with biographical material? Well, I would recommend this book here, which is The Bradbury Chronicles, The Life of Ray Bradbury by Sam Weller. Now my understanding is that Sam Weller really began this book when he interviewed Ray to write a newspaper article or a magazine article. And then he got to talking to Ray further and did an extensive series of interviews over a period of years, and then wrote up all of his findings from the interviews and from other research that he'd done, and interviews with other people, and wrote it up as an account of Bradbury's life. So much of it is spoken by Bradbury because he's being directly quoted from interviews, but much of it is presented as if spoken by Bradbury, because Weller is really good at channeling the feelings of Bradbury and what it was like to grow up in Waukegan, Illinois in the 1920s and 1930s and so on. So it's a very readable book. It's a very fast read as well. Even though Bradbury lived a very long time, he lived well into his 90s, the book is a breeze of a read, and it's not as long as some of Bradbury's short story compilation books. So The Bradbury Chronicles is well worth a look. And one of the nice things about the book is it's got lots of photographs in the centre section. So there are photos of Bradbury as a child, photos of his immediate family, photos of him with famous people selling newspapers on street corners in Los Angeles, leading to these sort of late in life celebrations of Ray, such as the naming of a park after him in his hometown of Waukegan. So The Bradbury Chronicles is really worth a look. Do watch out though, there are some other books out there called The Bradbury Chronicles. It seems to be an obvious title for people to take a title of a Bradbury book, in this case The Martian Chronicles, and then take out a word and stick Bradbury in there. So there are some other books called that. So if you're looking for the biography, it's the one by Sam Weller. And finally, what about media adaptations? Well, some of you may know me from my website, which is bradburymedia.co.uk, which started as a website where I kind of explore all aspects of Bradbury's work in media. It's expanded and evolved over the years. It's also stagnated a little bit, for which I apologise, but Bradbury Media is where I got started in documenting Bradbury's work, and I was concentrating on the adaptations. So let's have a look at some of the best adaptations and where to begin if you want to see some Bradbury on screen. Frankly, I think the best film from a work by Bradbury is probably Fahrenheit 451, in terms of being a good film. In terms of being the best representation of Bradbury on screen, I would argue that Something Wicked This Way Comes is closest to that. And the reason I say that is because it really does capture the spirit of small-town America, early 20th century, and the idea of good versus evil and carnivals and circuses and all that kind of stuff that we associate with Bradbury from his fiction. Not just from the novel Something Wicked This Way Comes, but from other works that he wrote as well. But there are other things out there to look out for. Some people like The Illustrated Man, and maybe if you follow my suggestion of reading the book The Illustrated Man, maybe you'll be tempted to watch the film of The Illustrated Man. It's available on DVD and Blu-ray, and it stars Rod Steiger and Claire Bloom. And There are some moments in it that are very, very good, but as a film it doesn't hang together at all, and I think the filmmakers didn't really understand what they were doing, to be honest. Another item to look out for is Moby Dick, the 1956 film starring Gregory Peck. What the hell's that got to do with Bradbury? Well, he wrote the script for it. So it's based on the famous novel, but Bradbury wrote the script. And it's one of his best screenplays. And then the last thing to look at is the Ray Bradbury Theatre. Now, this is a real mixed bag of material. On the one hand, there are some great stories adapted here, and some of them stand up now. Many of them don't. And there is also a big technical problem with the Ray Bradbury Theatre. Ray Bradbury Theatre was an anthology series, a kind of a Twilight Zone, with Ray as the host, although he only really appears in the title sequence of most episodes. But Ray wrote every single script. So where does the Ray Bradbury Theatre go wrong? Well, there are two ways that it goes wrong. One is a budgetary thing. It was made on a very, very low budget, and it travelled the world trying to find, well, a cheap way of getting made. It started off being produced in Canada, and then they made episodes in the UK, in France, in New Zealand. They were going to make some in Germany as well. They were basically travelling the world looking for cheap production facilities, so a way of making the show as cheaply as possible, and it shows. The other way that the Ray Bradbury Theatre fails is purely technically. It's a victim of that era, late 1980s, early 1990s, when television production was shifting from film to videotape. Now, we came through that, and we came out the other end, and we eventually got high definition television, and nowadays everything is done digitally, electronically, and it looks just like film, and we don't have any problems with it. But at that time, late 80s, early 90s, what they would do typically is they would shoot on film, and then they would transfer the film onto videotape, and then they would edit on videotape, and they would distribute on videotape. So you start off with something which is high quality film, but it's degraded in the process. Now, some shows of that era have been remastered because the original negatives have survived. With the Ray Bradbury Theatre, the way it was produced, different places all around the world, there's really very little hope of the negatives having survived, and if they did survive, very little hope of them ever being put back together again, because the production company or companies that made the series no longer exist. So we're really stuck with these standard definition masters, and then they've been released onto DVD, and this was done, quite early in the days of DVD, and the mastering on these is absolutely abysmal. These are some of the worst DVDs I've ever seen in terms of technical quality, and it's simply because they've tried to cram too much onto the discs. You can see on the front it says 65 episodes, and they're crammed onto too few discs. But if you can ignore that, if you can sit a long way from your TV set so that you don't notice the poor quality, this is worth picking up because you can get these fairly cheap. So the Ray Bradbury Theatre does a reasonable job of capturing Bradbury's short stories. But as you can probably tell from the way I talk about these, none of these really are perfect representatives of what Bradbury can do. And although I love very much film and TV and all the media, and I absolutely love exploring Ray's work in all the media, and I have found some gems, I'm afraid most of the media productions for film and television have been disappointing in some way. So if you're wanting to get into Bradbury and don't know where to start, well, by all means try one of these, but I think, to be honest, start with the books first. They will give you the best first impression of Bradbury. So thanks for joining me on this first Bradbury 101. In future episodes we'll explore Bradbury's work in more depth, and don't forget to check out my website bradburymedia.co.uk, where you can find out a lot more about Ray Bradbury, his life and his works. I'll see you next time.